We bring you the best guests in all of true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, Joel Waldman.
What's up, STS Nation? Welcome to Surviving the Survivor. It is a podcast that gives you trending case analysis and live breaking news with the very best guests in all of true crime. Today, it is the breaking news variety, as we got word not long ago that the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric Menendez, that their family is once again going to hold a press conference in downtown Los Angeles. Now, we've seen this movie before, to use an LA cliche.
To see what this family has to say.
This is
currently in my
live
office,
coverage of
so that
Los
means we are
Angeles
gonna
ABC
hope
News.
that Amazon does not decide to deliver to my house within the next 45 minutes or so, or you're going to hear my dogs lose their minds. So with that, I do have some remarks. This is a pretty exciting time for us as the family of Eric and Lyle Menendez. And I'd like to start with Governor Newsom's actions yesterday. They are a positive step forward towards Eric and Lyle's release. We are incredibly grateful that Governor Newsom is paying attention to this case, particularly those of us, those older family members, my mother, Terry Baralt, Joan Vandermolen, Kitty's sister. This is, for our family, it is a huge sigh of relief that someone in a seat of power is paying attention to what we have seen up close since Eric and Lyle have been incarcerated. We have seen their rehabilitation over the last 3 decades with no hope of release until now. Eric and Lyle have changed countless lives since their conviction in 1996. Inmates have seen it, corrections officers have seen it, and now we need the entire criminal justice system to see it. The resentencing process has been a long journey for us. Now with the new directive to the parole board, we are confident that they will determine the brothers are not a risk to public safety, proving what we have said all along. Important in this process is that this is not a political one. We look forward to their transparency and for the findings that will be released for everyone to see. Now let's take a look at the criteria the parole board will look at. Number 1 is remorse. Eric and Lyle have expressed immense remorse for their actions that night and in the months after, repeatedly. Decade after decade, I can personally attest to that. They look at number 2 is social history. Inmates, corrections officers, and administrators have all gone on record to say Eric and Lyle have been model people while incarcerated. They have run several programs to mentor inmates who they knew would see the freedom that they wouldn't. That is remarkable. Third, plans for the future. The parole board will look at their plans for the future. And Eric and Lyle have already done so much tangible good work while incarcerated for society. If released, they will continue to build on the work they've started. They'll look at institutional behavior. Everything I've just touched on shows that they have gone above and beyond to not only function within the walls of a prison, but improve the culture of that facility through their work. They have improved the community that surrounds them. And then they'll look at their age. You know, Eric and Lyle are both in their 50s. We all are. They have spent the majority of their lives incarcerated. And incredibly, they've managed to build meaningful lives year after year, program after program. And then they'll look at their lack of criminal history. They don't have a prior criminal record outside of making a horrific decision as a direct result of the abuse they endured for over a decade. The parole board must also factor in the fact that Eric and Lyle were still kids at the time of their actions. So Lyle was 21 and Eric was 18 at the time of the killings. There is overwhelming scientific research that proves the human brain, especially areas that regulate impulse control and decision-making, is not fully developed until someone is in their mid-20s. As the mother of a 17 and 18-year-old boys, I can attest to that as well. Both the legislature and the courts have recognized that youthful offenders have diminished moral culpability and a greater capacity for rehabilitation based on widely accepted scientific evidence on adolescent brain development. They must take that into consideration. I'll pass it over to Tamara.
Thanks, Anna Maria. I just really want to go over everything that they have done since they were convicted in 1996. I think it's incredibly important to stress that Eric and Lyle went into prison, into incarceration during their formative years, and have, for all intents and purposes, created careers for themselves while they have been incarcerated. And that is incredibly moving for all of us. While incarcerated, Eric has created and led several impactful programs, which I will detail now. The Life Care and Hospice Connections Program, which is an ADA awareness and support group assisting disabled and elderly inmates while educating others about the challenges faced by less able peers. The Victim Impact and Empathy Program, or VIVE, is a workshop fostering understanding and empathy by incorporating victim impact elements from the life care and hospice curriculum. Alternatives to Violence Project, AVP, is a series of workshops promoting nonviolent conflict resolution, self-awareness, empathy, and community building. The Starlight Peace Project is a program capturing images of peace in areas affected by violence. It has successfully coordinated 30 event leaders and engaged over 150 participants. Eric has also led 12-step and meditation classes. This combines the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous with mindfulness, meditation, and meditation practices. Insight meditation workshops, which introduces inmates to the physical, emotional, and spiritual benefits of mindfulness meditation. Eric has received dozens of commendations from prison supervisors for his leadership, mentorship, and his service to fellow inmates, which are all detailed in the People's Motion requesting 1172.1, recall of sentence and resentencing hearing. And with that, I will let Anne Maria go into Lyle's details of rehabilitation.
Thanks, Tamara. Lyle has also made significant contributions, creating and leading impactful programs. The Adverse Childhood Experience in Rehabilitation, ACER program, is a program helping offenders explore their childhood experiences and impact and contributions to criminal behavior. The Green Space Project spearheaded the beautification of prison spaces through murals and landscaping, reducing recidivism by normalizing the prison environment. Over 100 inmates participated, marking the first time prison administration entrusted an inmate to lead such a redesign. The Rehabilitation Through Beautification Project, RTB, a volunteer effort supporting the Green Space Project through mural painting and landscaping. The Youth LWAP Ally, a mentoring group for youth offenders with life without parole sentences, guiding others in their rehabilitation journeys. And the WIRE Bulletin, an inmate advisory bulletin fostering communication between the Inmate Advisory Council to the wider inmate population. Their achievements, both Eric and Lyle, would be inspiring for anyone, but as incarcerated individuals, they are truly amazing. And now I want to talk about the narratives painted by the district attorney at the press conference, which closely illustrated those presented at the first trial. First, no one is disputing the crime, not even Eric and Lyle. All we are asking for is the DA to consider their prison record as a whole, their rehabilitation, the remorse they have expressed, and the new evidence the habeas petition introduces, which corroborates Eric and Lyle's story. While we are not surprised that the district attorney took the stance that he did with the habeas petition, we were surprised to see it litigated the way that it was in the press, with the press. The danger of presenting that 1990s narrative under today's laws and modern understanding of trauma is that it ignores how far we have come in recognizing the long-term effects of abuse and the systemic barriers that keep victims silent. Today, we understand that trauma rewires the brain and shapes a person's actions and decisions in ways that were not fully appreciated decades ago. California law has evolved to reflect this, acknowledging that childhood abuse profoundly impacts behavior and should be a critical factor in the justice system. It's not just about speaking out, because for many survivors, that is an impossible task. The very act of acknowledging their trauma can take years, sometimes a lifetime. The expectation that victims should have immediately disclosed their abuse ignores the reality of trauma. Many survivors struggle with self-blame, fear, and shame, all of which are exacerbated by a system that has historically dismissed their voices. While we acknowledge that the district attorney has a duty to prosecute cases based on the law, we must ask, is he applying the law as it exists today with a modern trauma-informed understanding? Or is he relying on an outdated, harmful framework that has since been rejected? While we don't want to focus too much more on his comments on the habeas petition, we do want to take a moment and address his comments on the letter Eric sent to Andy and Roy Rosello's testimony. Andy received the letter in December of 1988. The time for proving the authenticity of the letter will be discussed in court. But what we can say now is that Andy was a teenage boy at the time. He was 15, by the way. Actually, I think he was still 14. With all of the mounds of evidence presented in the first trial, it's only natural for a teenage boy to not realize he is sitting on critical evidence. Andy wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't even an adult. To pose the question now, decades later after he passed, of why wasn't the letter submitted back then, is like asking a teenager who got an offender bender, why didn't you call the police to file a report? Because a teenager doesn't know any better. He didn't realize how vital that letter would be to the case. Second, he indicated that Roy Rosello's testimony doesn't meet the habeas standards because he didn't come forward sooner. The whole point of a habeas petition is to include new evidence, and Roy coming out to share his story in his own time is new evidence. Again, how many victims have stayed silent because of the systems that are designed to silence and dismiss them? Let's bring the case back to 2025. Tamara.
Thanks again. It is also critically relevant to discuss the fact that California law increasingly acknowledges that youthfulness impacts decision-making, often leading young people to have irrationally or dishonestly in stressful and traumatic circumstances. Such youthful missteps should not overshadow or negate subsequent truthful disclosures. We, including California state law and every clinical psychologist, now understand that trauma, especially at a young age, can rewire someone's brain. The trauma, like Eric and Lyle endured, cripples victims' ability to think rationally before, during, and after taking action. Today, there's overwhelming evidence of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which show that early exposure to severe abuse fundamentally alters a person's mental and emotional behavior. If Eric and Lyle were tried today, California law would have compelled Hockman's office to consider the abuse that molded every fiber of their being. But Eric and Lyle are not kids anymore. They are grown men who have transformed their lives while incarcerated. We wish the DA had spoken about the programs that they have spearheaded, the support groups that they have started, the higher learning that they have pursued, and the numerous other inmates that they have inspired. Through their work, Eric and Lyle have shown who they really are, not who Jose and Kitty made them. They did all of this while fully knowing it may not mean a release for them, but a difference for those with whom they have served time. Eric and Lyle have dedicated themselves to extensive rehabilitation, education, and service during their incarceration, earning widespread admiration from peers and prison staff. And it's so important to emphasize that all of these actions and rehabilitation activities that they have completed were all done without any hope of being released. And then with that, I'll let Anna Maria talk about more growth and leadership.
I need to unmute myself. Eric and Lyle's remarkable growth, leadership, and rehabilitation efforts underscore their readiness to lead meaningful and productive lives outside of prison. Let's keep focusing on this. For our family, it has been 3 painful decades. We have been forced to live through the trauma every day since August 20th, 1989. We have become victims in this process. We have been laughed at, ridiculed, and forced to relive the pain over and over again. We ask that people visit our coalition page at justiceforericandlyle.org and sign the petition that's there. Thank you so much for your time. We'll open it up for questions.
Again, as a reminder, please either raise your hand or submit your question to in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer your questions. Tim, you have the floor.
Great, just unmuted. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
So thank you very much for doing that. I was wondering if you could a little more.
Tim, you're actually a little muffled.
How's that?
Much better.
Okay. I was wondering if each of you could reflect a little bit on their evolution in prison. And what I'm trying to get at is, was there like a specific turning point for each where they were at a crossroads and they decided to go in the direction of trying to turn their lives around? Because I imagine they didn't walk in the first day of their sentence and they're doing all these wonderful things. So I was wondering, was there a crossroads or a turning point where they went in that direction? If you could talk a little bit about that.
I'll take this first. I don't know that I can put a date. I can timestamp that. For sure, Tim, you're right that there was those early years in level 4 maximum security were rough. Were rough for them. Their experiences were rough. They were finding themselves as adults. Never mind, they were adolescents when they went into prison. So that was a tough evolution for them. I can tell you that I remember a moment in 2006. So this is now almost 20 years ago, when I was communicating with Lyle, and he sent me a letter that I will never forget because it felt different. It felt, he said, and this is sort of burned in my memory, so I know it by heart, actions are your personal tragedy. And that I know I can never take it back, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it better. And it was so stunning to me. I had seen him growing, but it was for me, it marked like this was a man who was taking complete ownership, complete accountability. And it's really been a beautiful thing to see their journeys.
I think just to add to that, in conversations with Eric, it's been not, to your same point, that wasn't necessarily one date. It was the result of a culmination of experiences and the witnessing of some very violent interactions within the prison system. And Eric, they made a very conscious decision to understand that he had to make the most of where he was, and made some decisions based on what he was seeing around him, and whether it was regarding poor prison conditions or poor treatment of inmates. He really wanted to work towards, how can I create a better place, not just for myself where I can exist, but how can I also affect those positively with those around me.
Thank you both. I'm going to call on Matt next. Matt, you have the floor.
Hi, folks. Thanks for taking this. And thank you for doing this press conference. I would just like to hear your reactions to Gavin Newsom's announcement yesterday that he is setting up this risk assessment investigation into whether the brothers would pose a risk if they were released, because in many ways that circumvents LADA Nathan Hochman's decision on resentencing. I mean, almost effectively it sets resentencing in motion. And I wanted to get your impressions when you first heard that news.
I'll take this. I was thrilled. First of all, I had a meeting with some of the members of the governor's office on Monday, where I was told, and it was thrilling. Although it was the beginning of the meeting was, we're not granting clemency, so keep your expectations in check. I was like, okay, but we are taking this step and we are providing risk assessment. And it was, there were definitely some caveats, like there are no guarantees. So remember that, this is not a guaranteed process. This is a very rigorous process that we are going to go through, because it is very important to California that they have a low recidivism rate. So they will be doing a very rigorous and full process with it. But this is huge. I mean, this is huge. And I cannot thank Governor Newsom enough for stepping in and initiating this process. We as a family, we understand that this is not without professional risk for him. So for him to step in and say, okay, let's actually find out if this is doable. Let's do a risk analysis, and then we can move forward. It's a huge relief. It's a huge relief to us.
Anna Marie, I have to ask you, can you take us into that room in that moment? Were there audible gasps? Were people, sort of like high-fiving? What was that mood like, and how did you and the people with you react?
Well, it was a very small group of people, like 3 people. And it was virtual. So I would have been high-fiving the air. And so I couldn't be high-fiving. I certainly gasped in relief, and it was that was great news. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Veronica, I'm going to call on you next.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much for calling on me. So I'm curious about the relationship that you have with District Attorney Nathan Hochman, seemingly very different than the relationship that you had with the former DA George Gascon. Can you comment on the decision to not recommend a retrial? Have you spoken with him? If not, do you have a message for Nathan Hochman?
The relationship is absolutely different. Gascon seemed much more open to modern thought processes of, where is the law today? What is compassionate look like, and what does trauma-informed practice look like? Very honestly, what we heard from the LADA's office the other day felt very disparaging. It felt like a continuation of the narrative from 1989, and very honestly, it was very frustrating. There have been so many developments that could have been brought into focus, and it was incredibly disappointing to hear that there was no mention of the rehabilitation, no mention of the positive contributions that Eric and Lionel have made to the prison system. And I say system because they have been in multiple facilities, each of them. So it's really important to recognize that and to know that they have had so many recognitions and commendations from the officers, and that went unnoticed by him, or at least he made it seem that way. So it was very, very disappointing, in my honest opinion. So Anna Marie, I'll let you speak to that.
Well, first of all, we, with the last administration, we worked with Rock and Nancy, were the ones who headed up that resentencing group, and that they were tremendous. They were really supportive, and they were very well informed about trauma. I think the press conference with the district attorney last Friday it felt extra hurtful because it was only a few weeks ago that dozens of us sat in his office and described to him the horror of being in this victim's family, with 35 years of being re-traumatized over and over and over. With my 85-year-old mother with cancer sitting 10 feet away from him, literally sobbing in front of him. And then to see him decide to go make a press conference that didn't have to be a press conference, and just in gruesome detail and even a little bit embellished. There were details that weren't even accurate as far as the original crime scene. So that felt really hurtful to a lot of us. And I do want to say that when I spoke with my cousins, it was very afterwards. They, didn't have a chance to see that live, but their biggest concern was that they had heard about it and how were we doing, because they knew that that would have been gut wrenching for us, and it was. So that's my reaction.
And to piggyback on what Anna Maria said, Eric had just said, "We need you strong," and they both really mirrored our frustration, but they also said, "Let it go. We need to focus on moving forward." And so that is our focus.
Thank you. Hannah, you now have the floor. Hannah, if you still have a question, I think you should be unmuted.
Sorry, actually, it's Natalie Morales. I just wanted to follow up on that. You talked about the emotions that Eric and Lyle sort of conveyed in that moment. I'm wondering if you can give us a little more detail as to how they're doing now. Of course, following Friday's news conference from Hochman to then the turn of events yesterday with the governor announcing this risk assessment.
Cautious optimism, I think, is really the way to say it. Also, it's been a real learning process for us as a family, and for them too, because this is a new process that that the governor is using in California. So they, when we talk about parole boards and going to parole, they have lots of experience with other inmates, seeing them go through that process, understanding what that's about, what it looks like, getting turned down, that type of thing. So they have a really good, clear grasp on that. And so this is a little bit of a newer process, this risk assessment being done through the parole board initiated by the governor. Oh, excuse me. So I think that they are cautiously optimistic, but we're all sort of still trying to figure that out.
And just adding to that, one of the things that they are also very aware of is that, and they try to just follow in the lines of caution, they are the first life without parole prisoners on this path. So when we look at any advancements or developments, it's definitely with hope, but also understanding that there are no promises.
Thank you. And I'm going to call on Emily. If you still have a question, you have the floor.
Hi, Emily Valdez here. So there are two remaining options. Well, actually three still, but two more likely remaining options. One would be the resentencing. The other would be the clemency from the governor. How confident, which path do you think is the most likely, and how confident are you that they actually will be released under one of these?
I don't feel qualified to answer that question. I feel like that's a legal team question for me. I don't know what's more likely. I just hope something. That's it.
Agreed. I feel the same. It's I wouldn't even know where to start with that other than we're just hopeful. And to know that we're now having a clear, direct response from Newsom is just, I think, beyond our expectation at this point. So knowing that there is a timeline that has been started by his initiation of this investigation, we're just holding on to that hope and moving forward as we can.
And do you know if the governor's investigation will be done by the time their next court hearing on March 20th?
That I don't know. I know that they have 90 days, but we have not been given any more information than just knowing that it's been initiated.
Okay, and just for clarification, can you each clarify your relation to Lyle and Eric for me?
Sure, I'm a first cousin. So Jose was my mother's brother.
And I am a second cousin. My mother is Karen Vandermolen, which has been interviewed multiple times, but then my grandmother is Joan. So
Jamie, you're up next. You have the floor.
Hi. So previously you guys had expressed concerns about conflicts of interest within the DA's office. And earlier you mentioned Nancy and Brock, who, filed we're going to file that lawsuit against DA's office for discrimination, as well as Milton's lawyer, I think, being hired into the office. Are those still concerns for you guys? Are you doing anything about it? Still calling on someone else to take over the investigation, or what's the status on that?
Those were certainly concerns of ours, but we're not taking any sort of formal steps regarding that. That's one of the reasons we are just so thrilled that Governor Newsom decided to step in and initiate this process himself. We're super, super grateful.
Thank you.
And we're going to do one last question. Edgar, you're going to have the floor.
Hello, you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Edgar Munoz. Have you thought of the possibility that if the verdict is not in your favor, and Eric and Lai continue impression. And Ana Maria, do you speak Spanish? My newscast is in Spanish.
Muy bien. Yeah. Lo comprendo perfectamente bien, pero no lo hablo muy bien.
Okay, in English is good.
So the possibility that it doesn't go our way, that's a possibility. You know, we would be foolish.
I hate when I start talking. This is why we do have the best guests in all of true crime. Josh Ritter here from Courtroom Confidential. I did a whole intro to myself when I was muted just now. So this is
that everybody will have
round
a chance
two,
to
but
see the results.
I'm going to mute her because this is the final question, and Josh only has about 20 minutes, and I want to dig in here. So for those who've been living under a rock, Lyle and Eric Menendez are accused and convicted, I should say, of murdering their parents, Jose and Kitty, back in 1989. They grew up in the Princeton area and moved out to Beverly Hills. The father was a very successful music executive. So there was a mistrial the first time around. Second trial, a lot of the essay was suppressed. That evidence was basically not brought in. And then there was convictions in 1996. But these guys have basically been in prison or behind bars since the early 90s. And Josh, you know, there's been back and forth, and we'll get to the most recent, which is obviously Governor Newsom now asking for a risk assessment. This was an odd news conference, one that you would never see pre-COVID, but post-COVID, Zoom is the norm. And so you had cousin Anna Maria Baralt, Jose Menendez, the father, is her mother's brother. And you heard her say she's 85 with cancer, completely believes the brothers, and this is her own brother, Jose, that she is speaking of, this 85-year-old woman. The other woman is Tamara Goodell. She's a second cousin through Joan Vandermolen, who is Kitty's sister, I believe, if I had that correct. But Josh, without further ado, there's sort of a political, they're kind of like monkey in the middle with a political battle going on right now. But DA Hochman came out. We'll get to that in a moment. But most recently, and it was yesterday, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, he came out and essentially asked for a risk assessment. What does that mean in English?
Well, it's the first step towards, it would be the first step that the parole board would take if they were considering parole. But because they're not even eligible for parole, the request had to come from the governor's office, and it would be the first step towards him perhaps entertaining the idea of clemency, because nobody's going to put out their neck without some coverage. So all this risk assessment does, though, is really try to summarize what their behavior has been since their time in custody. So, you know, have they been in fights? Have they been involved in gangs? Have they been involved in drug running? There's a lot of trouble someone can get up to when they're behind bars. And does that mean that if these people were to be released, what is their level of risk that they might reoffend, that they might be violent, that they might not be able to acclimate to society outside of being jailed? So, you know, especially coming on the heels of the announcement that Hochman made last week, this was kind of a whiplash for people who've been following this closely, because the governor had until this point just been taking this really hands-off approach, kind of like wait and see, you guys hash this out, and then maybe I'll weigh in at a later time. But now he's being much more proactive, which is funny to me because it kind of puts him down this path where he's eventually then going to have to make some decision. Whereas before then, it was kind of like he didn't really have to make any decision and could let everybody handle it themselves. But that's what he decided to do. And now, you know, you make an excellent point about this press conference and the bizarreness of it. This whole thing has become almost like this publicity campaign where everybody's doing press conferences and talking about how they feel about it and trying to persuade public opinion on the whole thing. It's very bizarre.
It really is. I mean, just the whole thing. I mean, even the way it looks. They're on a delay. Like, if you're gonna do this, why not just do it on the steps of the courthouse in LA? I understand it's it's probably difficult for them to. I don't know where they live to constantly be traveling if they're on the East Coast, but Matt Gutman, who's ABC News, and he was there. He was asking the family essentially, how they felt about DA Hochman's recent press conference. And basically, for those who did not see it, DA Hochman just took office from George Gascon, who's much more liberal, kind of left-leaning, easier, I guess some would say, when it comes to the law. Nathan Hochman, very law-oriented, law comes first, by the books kind of guy. And he came out and said, and he basically litigated the case, which we'll get back to in a moment. But Matt Gutman's question to the family was, does this risk assessment and the possibility of clemency, does it just completely undercut DA Hochman? Josh, I assume that the governor has the final say here. I mean, he's more powerful politically than DA Hochman. So is it true that Gavin Newsom could come in and effectively say, I don't care what Hochman says, I'm letting these guys go, although it could come with political risk?
Yeah, 100% he could. And he could have at any point since he's been governor, by the way. It's not like he needed some request to do this. This whole thing has been stirred up because of this kind of recent media push, but he received a letter from Gascon before Gascon lost the election asking him to entertain clemency. And that's when he started to kind of respond to it. But it's not like you need to request clemency. He could have just granted them that if he felt that it was appropriate. So that's another strange wrinkle in all of this. But so everybody watching and listening understands, there was the habeas petition, which was filed by his attorneys. That was what Hochman was responding to last week when he said, we're opposing that.
And Josh, just you're the lawyer, you're prosecutor of the year, but most of us don't understand. So what does the habeas mean again in English?
A habeas is, think about it like your Hail Mary petition for appeals. It's like you've exhausted every other appeal and you're finding one last ditch reason to go in front of the appellate court. And it had a very slim chance anyways. But the DA's office had never formally responded to it. So his press conference was to say, we're going to oppose that. And then he gave a bunch of reasons why. Independent of that are two other things. It's the clemency, which the governor can do at any point, which is what this press conference is about, because the governor just said, I'm going to have this risk assessment done, which might be the lead up to granting that. And then on March 20th, there's going to be the hearing on resentencing, which was brought by the DA's office. So if the governor does nothing, they're going to have this hearing on resentencing. And if the judge grants them resentencing and the prosecution is still in favor of resentencing, then they could be eligible for parole and it would be sent over to the parole board. Or the governor could, if they don't grant them resentencing and they're denied that, the governor could step in and say, I'm giving them clemency. So you're right. At the end of the day, the one with the most amount of power to do anything about that is the governor, and he can do that at any point he chooses.
It's interesting. The chat is pretty evenly split with let them out and keep them in. So it is polarizing, maybe not as polarizing as Karen Reed, but this has been around a hell of a lot longer. I had to get that.
I feel like, do I have to cross myself whenever we say that name on this channel?
So let me just go through this press conference. So again, Anna Maria Baralt, she is the first cousin. She came out and she started by saying, look, they are no longer a threat. They are remorseful. She says, I can personally attest to this. And then goes on to talk about how they're model inmates, that they've done good work. She said, you have to look at their age. They're in their 50s now. When they went in, they were in their early 20s. She talked about how there was no history of crime until this horrific abuse. She basically implied force them or propel them, whatever word you want to use, to murder their parents. And then she made, Josh, an interesting argument, which a lot of people will say is, I'll never use this word again in my life, hogwash. But she says that they were still kids. At the time, Lyle was 21, Eric was 18. So officially, they're both legally adults at that time. But she went on to talk about how there's new scientific research about impulse and how your brain develops. And she talked even about her own kids being 17 and 18. This is a cousin. She has a 17-year-old and 18-year-old boy who have issues with impulse control. So Josh, I mean, the question here is, things have changed tremendously in terms of perception of SA, in terms of what we do know about, how the brain reacts, all these different things. How does that play into the decision to resentence? Again, Gascon basically litigated this in the press conference, going point by point, explaining why it seems like he wouldn't budge, but maybe he will.
Yeah. Hochman went budge in his press conference.
Hochman, correct.
Here's the funny thing. Everything that they're saying in this press conference today, the family members who are in support of them being dismissed, it's all true. I mean, it sounds like they have been model inmates. It sounds like they've been tremendous inmates, and they have tried to turn their life around, and they have, they had not committed crimes. But, well, I don't know if that's entirely true. There was some evidence that they may have done some residential burglaries before that, but all of their points that they're making are true. Here's the thing, though. I feel strongly about this, and I think that the judges and prosecutors certainly feel strongly about this. We really have to think, when we want to overturn a jury verdict, there should be something very sacrosanct about the idea that you put on a trial and 12 people made a decision, and we should view that as the final decision on what took place in the case. And if we start creating a precedent of going back and rethinking jury convictions because we just feel differently about cases 30 years later in retrospect, culturally, I think that that's a very slippery slope. I don't think that their arguments are completely to be dismissed out of hand. I think we have changed significantly how we view this, especially male victims of SA. But a jury spoke, a jury deliberated, and a jury spoke. and that should be, I think, respected. And if your best reason for coming in is we feel that they've done their time, we feel that it's been enough time and they've been model inmates, I don't know if that is enough to overturn a jury verdict. And I think that's why Hochman, in his press conference, spent a considerable amount of time talking about the murders themselves, the circumstances of them. He didn't really need to do that in that press conference. The press conference was about the habeas, which really doesn't have to do with the crimes. And he spent a considerable amount of time talking about the premeditation, the violence of the murders themselves, their actions trying to cover it up, because to me, he's setting the table for maybe opposing this resentencing when it comes up for those same reasons, and for the same reason of, do we really want to set a precedent of just letting people out because we feel like now, 30 years later, enough's enough?
All really good points. I mean, DA Hochman did lay out, as I said, like point by point. And in this press conference today, the cousin Anna Maria said something along the lines of that they were surprised and not too thrilled, I guess, by the fact that Hochman went into the level of detail that he did. The family needs to be careful here, I think, because you want to keep the DA in your good graces. What kind of fine line is that, Josh, where they don't, because there are indications that Hochman could sort of, give in to this, but at the moment he's not. But then for the family to come out and say, he shouldn't have litigated this in a news conference, that's not going to help their cause, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree with you. I thought they were really critical of Hochman. Like they did not take a very diplomatic approach to how they spoke about him. They were very critical, and they compared him to Gascon quite a bit. I can't imagine Hochman watching this press conference was all that pleased with the way that they spoke about him. But this is also such a bizarre case because usually when you have these cases where people are asking for some sort of, reconsideration years later, it's a much more, you have like victim's family and perhaps defendant's family. And they might both have impact statements on how this has affected their lives. In this case, the victim and the defendant's family are one in the same family. And they both advocate for the release, or all but one of them advocate for the release of the defendant. So there's really no one taking the position of the victim's side in this whole thing. We don't hear from family members saying, my sister died or my brother died and was killed brutally. And there's one exception, one family member who's opposed to it, but it is a bizarre situation because usually the quote unquote victim's family's input weighs heavily on these decisions. But here they're entirely in favor of the defendants being released. So I think Hochman probably views himself as that surrogate in standing for kind of the voice of the victims here. And that, again, we shouldn't just dismiss out of hand how horrific these crimes were because they've been good inmates and because 30 years has passed by.
Yeah. Josh has about 5 or 6 more minutes, but Kathy had a question up there that I just took down. I don't know why, but it was basically asking what are the chances of an actual new trial? What do you think of that? I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I would think that is very slim. It's either they're getting clemency, the DA is going to go easy on them, or they're sticking around in prison for the rest of their lives.
I agree with you. I think the chance of a new trial are slim to none. The real opportunity for that was the request from the habeas that we talked about. And because the DA's office is opposing that habeas, it had it was barely clinging to life as it was. And I think it's all but over. And that was the only remedy that the habeas was asking for, was for a new trial. So you're absolutely right. This is kind of an all or nothing when it comes to the clemency or the resentencing. And the resentencing is probably got less of a, I mean, if you're asking which do they have a better chance at, it's such a difficult question to answer now. If the governor's for it, they've got a fantastic chance. If the governor wants to see what the DA does, they don't have as good a chance. And it looks like this DA might not view resentencing as favorably as the prior DA. And then it's still up to a judge. I mean, here's the other thing that nobody's really talking about. The defense could go in there and say, we want him to be resentenced for all the following reasons. And the DA could go in there and even say, you know what, we don't object to resentencing. And a judge could say, I'm not signing up for this. I don't see any reason to overturn a jury verdict. You've presented nothing to me that makes me feel like why I should undo what 12 people decided 30 years ago as the final word on this whole case and deny it. So, I mean, there's still a lot of kind of people who have their a lot of cooks in the kitchen as far as what could happen with the resentencing.
Yeah. This is so interesting. Free the Menendez brothers. The parents were abusive monsters. Other people are like, keep them in there. They deserve to be where they are. So again, people are very split on this. So we didn't get to the second cousin, Tamara Goodell. She talks about how they went into it, and it was awkward because they would like kind of hand off to each other. And you could tell that the first one, Anna Maria, is definitely the more dominant, maybe even a little bit more knowledgeable. So it was just an odd, like optically speaking, it was an odd press conference. But Tamara Goodell says the brothers went into incarceration in their 20s, but when they were in there, they created careers. Erica's created and led programs, she said, specifically a program that assists the disabled and elderly. And then the other one, and she hands it off, Anna Maria talks about Lyle, that he started this green space project had this idea for painting murals within prison that helped reduce recidivism rates. These sorts of things, who's looking at this sort of thing? Is this the kind of thing that governor is asking for right now? Why do they bring that up? How important is it that there were model inmates? And There are a lot of model inmates, I'm sure.
There are. Listen, I applaud everything they've done. Everything it sounds like they've done since they've been in prison sounds incredible. And it sounds like they've done a bunch of really great programs and a lot of self-betterment too. And it's important for this risk assessment. And it's likely important to the governor if he's going to actually make a decision to do something about this. He wants to know, he wants to make sure they haven't committed a bunch of crimes since they've been in prison. But, at the end of the day, I'm not really trying to advocate either side to this, but at the end of the day, when the DA's office is taking a look at this, all of that is fantastic. And then they look and they go, you shotgunned your parents to death. And you had to reload your shotgun before you put one final round into the side of your mother's head. And it's just awful. And then you lied about it. And then you tried to convince others to lie about it. And then you tried to cover it up. And then I don't think you can disagree with how horrific the murders were. I think you can debate their reasons for it. I think you can talk about how have they conducted themselves since then. But I think no one can reasonably look at this and not say it's probably some of the more horrific murders that we've talked about in 30 years.
Yeah. As part of this habeas, which Josh described as a Hail Mary appeal, which then Nicole called the Doug Flutie appeal, which you guys have to Google Doug Flutie if you don't know who Doug Flutie is. But you see here, Path Tech Lisa, I don't believe the letter is real. This could be the biggest sort of key piece of quote unquote new evidence. This is the so-called Andy Cano letter. And this is a letter that Eric wrote to his cousin, who was then just a young teenager. I believe family members said he was 14 at the time, essentially outlining the abuse that he'd been suffering at the hands of his father. But this letter didn't really come into existence in the public domain, I think, till like 2020. Like it took a long while. Andy had a drug issue, and sadly he passed away many years ago. But Josh, how do you prove if this, DA Hockman talked about it, there was no postmark, et cetera, et cetera. There's no way to prove the validity of this letter. This would be one of these things a jury would have to decide. There's no more jury. So who's going to look at that letter? Because that could be very key.
Yes. And then I got to run, but you're absolutely right. And that's what he spent a lot of his press conference talking about, is that there's no postmark, there's no date. We can't even really foundationally establish when this was written or who wrote it. And his point was that it's not reliable enough for the habeas, and that's why we're opposing the habeas. But he also used that to kind of dovetail into, I don't know how much we can believe these brothers to begin with. And then he kind of talked about all of the changing narratives and changing stories and everything that they went into. To me, it was more of an opportunity for him to, like I said, kind of give everybody a soft landing that he might not be feeling about this case the same way that his predecessor had. But I got to run before I get yelled at. I'm so sorry.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Great
Of
insight.
course.
Courtroom Confidential.
Thank you, guys.
Check it out. Bye-bye. So that was Josh Ritter of Courtroom Confidential. Great, relatively new podcast. And definitely go subscribe, check it out, watch, learn. Josh has a great handle on the law. So again, this Andy Cano letter, for those who are just joining, we just saw a news conference with two cousins of Lyle and Eric Menendez, one cousin, Ana Maria Baralt, whose mother is Jose Menendez, the father's brother. If I just confused you, you should be. But it's, again, this woman's mother is the brother's father's mother. How confusing can that be? Tamara Goodell, she's also a cousin of Lyle and Eric Menendez, a second cousin. So they both spoke, and then they kind of went through all these points, which I just outlined. And then Ana Maria, they got back to her, and she talked toward the end about, for our families, it's been 3 painful decades. She recounts the date, August 20th, 1989. That's hard to believe. And says that the family's been reliving the pain. And then, in an obvious PR move, said you can go to justiceforlyleanderic.org. They have a website set up. Luigi Mangione has, I guess, all these inmates now. That'd be a good business, creating websites for inmates. Space Coast, we might be onto something. But they obviously put that out there so you can go ahead and sign it. And then they took questions. One of the questions was, what is your relationship with DA Hochman versus the former DA George Gascon? And again, this is where the family, I don't want to say teed off on DA Hochman, but it was clear that they're not happy with DA Hochman. And I think they have to be careful there because you want to be in these politicians' good graces, as bad as that sounds, but they are the quote unquote decision makers. This was interesting. I didn't know this. And the cousin said that this would be the first ever LWOP prisoners, life without parole prisoners, on this particular path. I don't understand that. If anyone does understand that, aka Vesper Martini or Julie Frew, let me know. But that was a little bit confusing to me. And that was pretty much a wrap for the press conference. There is a court date set for this resentencing aspect of the case, just for the resentencing aspect of the case, which is what DA Hochman sort of was talking about, in addition to the habeas motion. So the court date is March 20th and 21st, and we will be covering that live, of course, and we'll have Super Planner remind me of that. March 20th and March 21st. They will physically be in a Los Angeles courtroom for a potential resentencing. I suppose they could be resentenced on the spot there. A lot of things could happen. So just to recap very quickly, there are 3 different pathways right now for the Menendez brothers to either get out or stay in. Number 1, this clemency request by the governor, who now is running a risk assessment to see if they are quote unquote safe. And you heard Josh say, no politician is going to do this without cover. So he's going to be able to say, hey, I did a risk assessment. Everyone told me they're safe. If they get out, hopefully nothing happens. If something was to happen, the governor would be in a lot of political peril. Then there's a habeas petition, which was filed, I believe, in 2023. And that is, as Josh Ritter called it, the Hail Mary last final appeal. And then you've got the whole resentencing issue. So that's point number 3. And they're going to look at prison conduct, rehabilitation, and of course, I took some notes. Political dynamics are going to play a big role. I saw Ned Smith irritated that politics plays a role. It's part of life, man. Part of life. Why did I have kids, man? World can be a horrible place sometimes, but it can also be good. Anyway, my final thoughts are thank you for being here. Hit the like button, subscribe. We're coming back at 7 o'clock. We've got some interesting guests. We've got a former female inmate to talk, Donna Adelson, and a sort of a white collar prison consultant, and the professor, Joe Patuto. So we're going to talk more because Donna doesn't like jail. She says it's tough and difficult, and she wants to get out. And she's even willing to live in Tallahassee with an ankle monitor, which is the reason this murder for hire plot with the Adelsons killing Dan Markel was reportedly why the hit was put on them, because Donna did not want the kids living in Tallahassee. Now Donna is begging to live in Tallahassee. The irony is rich. Her son, Charlie, is convicted. She could be next. We'll be talking about that. 7 o'clock tonight. Love you, America. Love you, Los Angeles. And justice for Dan Markel. And however you feel about the Menendez brothers, may your wishes come true. See you guys later. Space, good job, homie. Thank you. That was good.
Yeah, no worries, dude.
Dude, let's start the website company for prisoners. They all need one. So crazy.